All right, we're going to dive now into this issue of personhood and how it relates to abortion. This is really the key issue to the entire abortion debate. The question is, what makes a person a person? Personhood is the point at which an embryo is recognized as having basic human rights. So, when do we decide that a baby is a baby and not just a potential person? What's the line between a potential person and an actual person? If we draw the line and say, well, if it's 20 weeks, up to 20 weeks, you're a potential person, not a person, then we don't have any problem with abortion because we're not taking the life of a person. We're just denying a person the right to life to begin with. So it's not like we're taking a life. It's different. But if we draw that line very early on, then we have a problem. But personhood is the only thing that separates abortion from murder. It's the only issue that makes those two things different. And you can see Congress struggling with that in that case from Gonzalez versus Carhart. But we want to look at a few considerations here when we try to determine. So what you need to find out as you think about your ethical views or your moral views of abortion, you've got to answer this question. You can't get around trying to answer at what point do we recognize a baby as a baby. And if you're trying to build an idea of abortion without considering this, then I hate to be harsh, but I would say that your opinion is not a very good one because it's not based on the facts and reality. It's just based on maybe opinion, which I guess depending on your view of ethics might be fine. But let's talk a little bit about I think I got my notes here out of order, so I'm going to do this again and just stick to the PowerPoint. So this is the key issue, personhood. Where do we draw the line? And I've got a few different places where we might be able to draw the line. So we'll set these up. We'll give kind of why they make sense and then why they don't. So the first one is vitality. Should we say that an infant is a person when the infant can survive on its own outside the womb? Or you'll see that some of these, like fetus and infant, I'll probably use those interchangeably. Embryos a little bit earlier of a stage, obviously, but this is the point at which the baby can live on its own outside of the womb. As we said earlier, that could be anywhere from 24 to 26 weeks. And that kind of makes sense, right? Well, let's say whenever the baby can survive on its own, well, now it's its own person, right? Because it's not depending on the mother anymore. It's its own biological entity at this point. Well, that's well and good, except for vitality doesn't really depend on the autonomy of the baby. It depends on the medical technology available. Children born this early are placed on life support in order to survive. So if you're in a third world country without medical technology, there's vitalities at a much later point in pregnancy than if you're here in all of the wealth and excess of the United States. So then we have to draw the line of vitality at different places in different countries. So we're saying that value of a person, or the point at which a person inherits human rights is based on medical technology. Well, I don't know that that's a problem that vitality can overcome here. It's a pretty big problem. What about brain development? This is the most commonly proposed decisive moment of personhood. It takes place about 45 days into the pregnancy. Brain development starts about 45 days in. This makes sense because medical death is defined by the cessation of all brain activity. So if we say that death is the absence of brain activity, then shouldn't we say the beginning of life is the activation of brain activity? That makes sense. But here's what doesn't make sense. pre-activity brains are not dead. They're developing. There's a big difference between something that's dead and something that's developing, right? A seed in the ground that's just now started to bud. Well, it might not have any flowers yet. It might not really have much, but just a tiny little, the tiniest little thing coming out of the ground. It's developing. It's not dead. So pre-activity brains, they are alive. There's biologically speaking, there's life in the fetus or in the embryo at this point. But dead brains obviously don't do much developing. So a key difference would, I guess, be brain activity can't be revived in a dead brain, but embryonic brains are developing, not dead. So maybe brain development, at second glance, might not be the best place to draw the line. So if it's not at vitality, if it's not at brain development, where is it? Well, maybe it's at sentience. And when we say sentience, what we mean is the point at which an infant or a fetus is self-conscious or has the ability to feel, or the point at which the fetus can experience some type of sensations or relationality, maybe respond to some sort of outside stimuli. It kind of is self-aware. And at that point, maybe self-awareness. Maybe when the baby starts responding to, even in the womb, when the baby starts responding to sound, when the baby starts responding to touch, maybe that's when we say, well, now this has gone from a potential person to an actual person. And that might make some sense too. Like maybe self-awareness is the thing that makes a person, or that would give a baby human rights instead of just no rights as a potential human. But the problem with this is, if we really believe that sentience is what makes a person, then we have a huge problem with everybody in a hospital who is not self-aware or who does not currently have the ability to feel. What about people who are in a coma? Do I all of a sudden lose my rights as a person if I get in an accident and fall into a coma? Just because I'm no longer self-conscious or have the ability to feel or to respond to any sort of outside stimuli, I'm still alive. I might not be able to respond to anything or be aware of my surroundings, but if I'm in a coma, I'm still medically alive. And as such, I would argue that maybe I'm supposed to still have the same rights as a person, not to be treated as something less than human at that point. So maybe sentience isn't the best place to draw the line either. But what about birth? This one's not very commonly held at all for reasons that we've already discussed. A fetus is the same a few minutes before the birth as it is immediately after. The only difference is the location changes. So making it birth is essentially saying, well, just the actual physical location of the baby is what makes it not a person or a person. So not very many people argue that birth is the point for personhood, although that might be, for some of us, what makes the most sense. But it doesn't make sense because biologically speaking, the fetus is the same, like those Australian philosophers said. It's scientifically speaking, it's the same before and after. So that there's not that much of a change. This one is going to be the traditional Christian perspective on the issue, for obvious reasons, even from Scripture, but also there's some evidence behind it. From conception, even from the moment of conception, an embryo already has a separate genetic identity. And all it needs at that point is nutrition and shelter to mature into a full-grown adult. So scientifically speaking, an embryo is not a potential person. it's the first stage of the growth cycle of humans. So a potential person would be better characterized by maybe the reproductive cells in a male or female. They're equal parts of the equation. And if you put them together, you'll get the embryo. But we wouldn't necessarily say that a sperm cell or an egg cell is a person, right? We wouldn't say that that's the first stage of the growth cycle. We would say that's before the growth cycle begins. And the growth cycle starts when those two things come together. And now you have an embryo, which is no longer just a potential person. Now you have the first stage. Scientifically speaking, you have the embryo as the first stage of the growth cycle of humans. So if it's the first stage of the growth of a person, maybe it makes sense to say this is where a person is a person, because this is when they actually this is when they hit the chart for the growth cycle of a human. And add to that the embryo already, even in conception, an embryo already has a unique and separate genetic identity from the mother. It's interesting that obviously infanticide and negligent homicide are punishable crimes that parents can commit against newborns. So the question is going to be, at what point does a child have a right to the care of their parents? Some will argue in the abortion debate that the child has no right to the care of the mother. If the mother was here first, it's the mother's life, it's the mother's body, and the child has no say-so in it. But after birth, you can be put in prison if you kill your child, or if you just decide to pack up and leave for the week and leave your baby at home. You're going to be put in prison for negligent homicide at that point, because we believe as a society, and it's reflected in our laws, that children have the right to the care of their parents. The question is, at what point does a child have the right to the care of its parents? So we've said I think, we're going to say a little bit more. Sorry. So the big question is, when does the embryo get those basic rights, like we just mentioned? Here's a few quick facts that we want to give. One, as early as, and we said from that Georgia law that they're drawing the line at 6 weeks, but as early as 18 to 25 days after conception, a baby's heart begins to beat. If you've ever been pregnant, or if you've ever been present at an ultrasound, you can go as early as just about 4 weeks, and they can detect a heartbeat in the ultrasound. So, in some cases, they'll run an ultrasound that early if there's certain medical conditions going on. But heartbeats can be detected pretty early on in some cases. But by the time you get to 2 months here, the embryo is not even an inch long, so it's tiny. So what could possibly be going on by the time you reach 2 months in something that's not even an inch long? Well, brain activity's begun. The baby actually already has feet, hands, and fingerprints. There's already eyes, ears, kidney, liver, bloodstream. They're starting to develop. But when exactly are we going to draw the line for personhood? A lot of these things at 2 months here, I think we would say, well, this definitely means it's its own person, right? But are we going to give it the rights of a person? Or do we want to wait till some later point to give it the rights of a person, even though biologically speaking it already is? That's the question we have to answer in abortion. Is at what point are we going to call a fetus a baby? And at what point are we just going to keep calling it a fetus like it's not actually a person? But the whole thing I think we're forgetting is that a fetus, an embryo, they're both a part of the growth cycle of humans. They're the first stages of growth. So just the sheer fact that it's a stage of growth and not like a potential person, it is a person in the beginning stages of growth. These are questions that we have to answer if we're going to have any sort of coherent opinion on the abortion issue. Now, I know this video is really short. We've only hit 15 minutes. But we're going to go ahead and pause here. And in the next video, we'll come back and we'll talk about what the Bible has to say about abortion. And then, depending on how long that video goes, we either stop it or we'll do a fourth one here to talk about the case for. We'll lay out the case for abortion rights. We'll bring up several arguments that are made on the pro-choice side of things. Bring up 7 of them, and then we'll bring up a balanced response to them, and then you guys can make your own decision based on some of the evidence for and against pro-life and pro-choice. But so far, we've covered the facts pretty much. We've covered the law. It's illegal for states to prohibit abortions, and it's legal in most places. It's legal for a woman to have an abortion for any reason at any point in the pregnancy, if it can be qualified as a health issue. But health issue can mean drama in the family. Health issue can mean having to drop out of school. Health issue can mean inconvenience, really. And it can mean relatively minor inconveniences as compared to life-threatening situations. So states don't have to pay for it, though, is the final thing that's relevant there. Now, the science that we just went over, embryos have a unique and separate genetic identity at conception. Heartbeat begins within the first month in some or most cases. Brain activity is present at 2 months, and that's where we're going to stop for now, and we'll come back in just a second and we'll start building this ethical ladder. But for now, we'll take a quick break.